Born in Cleveland, Ohio in 1932, R.B. Kitaj now lives and works in Los Angeles. He moved there with his young son Max in 1997, finally ending what he calls his London sojourn, a period of nearly 40 years during which he played a central role in the cultural life of the capital.
Well, I first met Kitaj at the Royal College in 1960. I'd been at the Royal College 6 years earlier, but he was there as a kind of on the GI Bill or something. So he was much older than the people he was with. He'd been a merchant seaman. He travelled the world. He was an ex-GI. I mean, he must have seemed an incredibly glamorous, wise figure to them. So someone like David Hockney, he would have been an enormous influence on.
He was a bit different from all the other students. First of all, he's about 6 years older than me, which when you're 22, that's quite big actually. He was married, he had a car, he lived in a house. He travelled, I mean, I'd never left England at that time, I remember a little provincial, so of course, yes, he seemed quite exotic. I mean, he'd been to Havana, he'd been to, you know, all kinds of, I mean, yes, of course it seemed interesting, romantic, yes, he'd been in Vienna, yes, he was actually, especially at that time.
In 1994, Kitaj's wife, American painter Sandra Fisher, had unexpectedly died at the tragically young age of 47, shortly after Kitaj's controversial retrospective at the Tate Gallery. This exhibition had provoked hostile and highly personal attacks on Kitaj from several London-based critics, who, amongst other things, took exception to the written explanations that Kitaj, unusually for a painter, had provided for his pictures.
When Sandra died, London just died for me. And so I would have left immediately when she died. But Max was at school, and he didn't want to leave his house, and I waited a couple of years before he decided that he wanted to move to California. And I said, let's go.
It was a tragedy that he left. I mean, I absolutely understand why he left, and I may well have done the same. I mean, there's never been such a concerted, awful attack on any artist that I've ever read about or known about. So he had every reason to go. I just miss him being here.
It was such a shock. I mean, she was a radiant health, actually. But I think it did occur to me that could have been more wounded than Ron was at the time. I think sometimes if you love someone, you can be more wounded by attacks on them than they are, actually. It did occur to me that.
It was an extraordinary hatred that brewed up, which was literally inhuman, because it is human to talk about pictures. People talk about paintings all day long, every day, year in and year out. We always love to talk about paintings and movies and books we've read and things like that. So it can't be an exclusive preserve of critics.
Kitaj has always been fascinated by the history of art and is constantly making references to past pictures in his own work. For example, Velázquez's large-scale landscape from the 1630s, showing King Philip IV of Spain hunting wild boar, becomes the setting for a painting of Kitaj's that was finished in 1984, called America Baseball, in which the artist, then living in his self-imposed London exile, indulges in a nostalgic fantasy picture about one of his great American passions, baseball.
Almost all my colleagues have a very, very strong relationship to the painting of the past, and in fact to other people's painting. I think there's not a single Lytton Gallery sculptor, not a single member of the Royal Academy who hasn't got a very intimate relationship with some or much of historical art, and if you question them, wouldn't be able to say interesting and familiar things about them. Kitaj seems to me as more inventive in using historical images and translating them into his painting, but there again there are people who do that habitually. Francis Bacon was one, and he's not unique, although I think that his conflation of fragments from other people's paintings and turning them into a personally experienced image is a rather personal way of working.
That was, at the time, actually, of course, that was quite traditional at that time, but not with students who thought they were near a cutting edge, as they'd say today. So students were trying to, they wouldn't go to the National Gallery, some of them at the time. I remember them saying that to me, and I thought, well, of course, I'm being provincial, and he perhaps being American, meaning in London, you use the museums, you see.
Eclipse of God, after the Uccello panel called Breaking Down the Jew's Door, finished in the year 2000, takes as its visual source a small panel by the Italian Renaissance painter Paolo Uccello. Uccello's picture is part of a series that tells how a family of Jews were lynched by a Christian mob for attempting to desecrate a piece of communion bread, an incident that allegedly occurred in Paris in 1290. Kitaj uses the pictorial devices of 20th century modernism, such as the abstracted geometry of the lynch mob, and replaces the medieval costumes of Uccello's painting with modern dress, and the implications of Kitaj's painting become chilling and clear. The title, Eclipse of God, is taken from a work by the eminent Jewish theologian Martin Buber, who was deprived of his post at the University of Frankfurt by the Nazis and fled Germany in 1938. Jewish subject matter is something that Kitaj has become preoccupied with relatively late in his career, but now he is considered to be one of the most important Jewish artists working in a post-Holocaust world.
Until our own day, there are about a dozen wonderful painters who happen to be Jews. None of them, as far as I'm aware, want to be called Jewish artists.
Would you want to be thought of as a Jewish
And I'm the only
artist?
one who seems to not mind. And not only do I not mind, I even press the case to places where people don't want to go. And of course, some people hate me for it. Some people are amused. My dear friends who are Jewish painters like Auerbach and Freud and the others are amused and tolerant and affectionate with me about it. But you'd be surprised how many people don't want to know. Like so many Jews in history, including Jesus Christ himself, my turn of mind takes me away from the establishment. And all through history, you'll find mavericks, dissidents, stirring up trouble like Jews always do, and getting into trouble like Jews always do. Jews fascinate me. They get me excited. I want to know about them. I want to know why they're always in trouble. It's something that's not only tragic, but it's like a human comedy. And don't think they haven't made jokes about it, Jewish jokes.
Perhaps his single most important explicitly Jewish painting is If Not, Not, which was finished in 1976. The painting has a literary source, T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land, a poem written in the immediate aftermath of the carnage of the First World War and revered by 20th century modernists. Kitaj makes use of its fragmented and loosely assembled structures, pulling together a composition of many disparate elements. The visual source here is from 16th century Venice, Giorgione's mysterious masterpiece known as La Tempesta, a picture that has long resisted art history's attempts at interpretation and casts its spell by visual means alone. At its centre is a pool of water, traditionally associated with life, but the pool in Kitaj's painting is dark and stagnant, set in what initially seems to be an idyllic landscape. Above looms the sinister and threatening gatehouse of the Nazi extermination camp at Auschwitz. This juxtaposing of the horrifying and the beautiful comes from Kitaj's recollection of a post-war traveller's account of a journey through the landscape around Buchenwald, taking in the last view that the doomed would have had through the slats of their cattle trucks. Scattered bodies refer to Conrad's novel, Heart of Darkness. The man in the foreground with the hearing aid, embraced by the naked woman, is a character who often appears in Kitaj's paintings, while the small figure in the bed, clutching a child, is the artist himself, floating in a sea of mud with the discarded detritus of civilization. The ram caught in the thicket is a traditional animal of sacrifice and acts as a reminder of the Old Testament story that tells of the moment when Abraham was about to sacrifice his son Isaac, only to have his attention guided by an angel to a last-moment substitute of a ram. This complex iconography is something that set Kitaj apart from his contemporaries, and his often obscure literary allusions have gained him both admirers and critics.
When Kitaj was a student, everybody was sloshing away with big brushes, and I dare say, in the way that these things go, Kitaj saw the limitations of that idiom and thought it was rather featureless and rather generalizing and rather repetitive. And having attended, I believe, Edgar Windt's lectures at Oxford, he tried to enrich painting by a more complex iconography. More complex wasn't very difficult because there wasn't any iconography at all, or hardly any. I mean, in Jackson Pollock there were certain totemic symbols, and indeed in de Kooning, but on the whole, iconography was almost non-existent, and the whole thing was to strike through the paraphernalia of life to some essential, liberating gesture, a single gesture that would unite one with the universe and make us all free and rid us of the atomic bomb.
What he was doing then was quite unique, actually. I mean, nobody else was doing anything like that then. I mean, you either had the school of, you know, English perceptual painting, art school painting at the time, or heavily influenced by then abstract expressionism. So somebody actually painting the figure, painting references like that was extremely odd, therefore attractive, I think, to some people.
He pioneered actually sticking things to the canvas. At the same time, Rauschenberg was doing it in America, but he used it in a very different way. He used it to add information. So you get a painted area and you get a collaged area. And then I suppose it was the iconography. I mean, it was his imagery and the fact that it was foreign and different, you know, and far more literary than I ever have been. And he's very erudite and he's incredibly well read. And I think that was one of the reasons he was so attacked over his show at the Tate, you know, that I think people, like writers, felt that he was treading on their toes. You know, that painters shouldn't know about literature, and I think that irritated people enormously.
Kitaj's interest in Cézanne has slowly been growing over the last 30 years. In 1988, he made a series of drawings at the Royal Academy, in an exhibition that brought together a large group of Cézanne's early paintings. Kitaj would visit the Academy first thing in the morning and make one drawing each day, extracting from Cézanne's paintings individual figures that caught his interest. The making of drawings has always had a central role in Kitaj's career, from his early days as a student in the Life Room up to the present. These drawings from Cézanne, made in charcoal on the roughly textured buff-coloured paper that Kitaj favours, are some of his most beautiful.
He draws like an angel. I mean, you know that however hard you try to draw like that, you won't be able to do it.
He has extraordinary gifts of, say, getting a likeness. People speak about getting a likeness in portraiture as though this was something fairly democratically distributed, but a pin-sharp likeness, a totally convincing likeness, miraculously sharp likenesses.
I mean, there aren't that many people draw that way anymore, and it takes time. I mean, it's practice. Skill is practice, so there's been a lot of practice, meaning a lot of time is put in. they're beautiful. The best of the drawings are just absolutely beautiful, I think. And not many people, as I say, even can do that now. It does need some training. Of course, that's what we had in common. We loved the activity of drawing, and drawing a human being, a figure.
In 1994, Kitaj finished this picture, Western Bathers, his first serious engagement with what has become his favourite National Gallery picture, Cézanne's Great Bathers. Western Bathers was painted in a spirit of burlesque, as Kitaj wrenches Cézanne's figures from their original setting and places them in a parody Hollywood Western.
It literally occurred to me, in sitting on that bench in the National Gallery so often, as I did so often, that they seemed to be gathered as if they were picnicking, so it might as well have been a gathering around a campfire. And I made them into a Western.
Well, quite camp cowboys, it
camp
has to be
cowboys,
said.
yes, allowing for every possible freedom of action and narrative, which there wasn't. And so it became a puzzle picture, which people can read into as they like. But I did consciously make it into a Western, you're right, because I love Westerns. And it's strangely enough, now that I'm living in Hollywood, it's a tradition that's almost lost.
In 1999, Kitaj accepted the National Gallery's invitation to show some of his work in an exhibition that would demonstrate his close relationship to the past. This provided him with the impetus to embark upon a major new series of paintings that derive from his great hero, Cézanne. In these new works, he confronts candidly the themes of love and loss that he himself experienced with the death of his wife Sandra. This is perhaps the biggest single project that Kitaj has undertaken in his career so far.
One of Kitaj's qualities, I think, is that he does that thing which is so admirable. He bites off more than he can chew. He has huge projects and goes for them. But I think that it's a quality that he if he sees something uneasy and uncomfortable, he makes for it.
This group of paintings have been quite an event for me, because of the National Gallery instigating this exhibition. Without that, I might not have stumbled across something that has become very, very important to me indeed. The pictures are inspired by my favorite paintings of all time, which are the three last bather compositions of Cézanne. The one that I know so well, like the palm of my hand, is in the National Gallery itself in London. The craziest of them is the one in the Barnes collection in Marion, Pennsylvania, outside Philadelphia. And the third one, the largest one, is in the Philadelphia Museum itself. So for a year and a half, I've been staring at reproductions of these things. I've seen them all in the flesh, and I never made an attempt to see them again. I've just been looking at books and pictures, and mainly details of these pictures. I have them in all kinds of forms all over the studio. Here's the London one. I have larger reproductions of it, but I know it so well. I've had the pages open at other points. Then over here is the Philadelphia Bathers. This is the one that seems the least finished. He seems to have worked on these three bathers. The third one is the one in the Barnes collection here. We'll come back to that because there are some important things that begin to happen for me. That's the craziest of them. He seems to have worked on these three great bather compositions for the last 11 or 12 years of his life, from 1895 to 1906, when he dropped dead. And they were found in his studio. He may never have finished them. He may never wish to have finished them. You have to realize one thing: he was a rich man, so he didn't have to sell them. He could just paint all day long, even though he was reclusive and hated by the art establishment in Paris and even in Aix. There are books here in my library which are all about that question of Cézanne, finished or unfinished. And it's fabulous because part of that unfinished turned the other painters, the succeeding painters on. Particularly in the case of Matisse, they never stopped. They never stopped working in the aura of Cézanne. Even when he was in his 80s, in my era, my own era, in 1950 and 51, working on those great blue cutout nudes, those are Cézanne bathers. No question about it. I have so many little rooms in this old house that I could make a room over to my favorite painter. And the reason I could do that so easily was because I have all the prints. This is the most famous one that everyone knows, the grand bathers, the large bathers. The second one is even more rare, the small bathers. He only made 3 lithographs, you see, and this is a lifetime proof. The old man was probably standing there when these were pulled. That's the third lithograph, I mean, the self-portrait. Then he made 5 little etchings, and 3 of them can be found sometimes. This is a very rare one in its first state, and you can see the difference between a lifetime proof like this and the same print in a later 20th century pull, which is very dull. There are 2 other ones, the little farmyard and the Guillaumin with the hanged man in the corner. There are 2 more, but they're unavailable. They're singular in museums. So I have all the, I could collect the ones that exist, and then I have a good Cézanne library. Having the Cézanne books mean more to me than even these prints do, because book publishing has got to the point where the reproductions are so fantastic that you don't even have to travel anymore. You don't have to see them in museums. Of course, that's not really the case, but it's the case with the Italians, for instance, when what I can see in a book is so much more than what I could see in a dark church in Italy. Don't forget, I'm 68 years old, and so I've been looking at the real thing for a long time, so one supposes that originally I was overwhelmed by the pictures themselves. But as one grows older and more solitary, and I don't go out very much, I depend less on going to museums, and now hardly at all. I can see all the Cézannes that we have in Los Angeles. I stick them up on this wall, for instance. The Getty just bought this great Italian girl, so I go and look at her all the time. They have 5 Cézannes at the Getty, and this is the most recent one. On my corner, just a few streets away at the UCLA Museum, they have this wonderful boy on the riverbank, which I've known all my life. And of course, I've seen him in Cézanne exhibitions. And now, whenever I want to see him, I just walk off the street and look at him and go away. Cézanne made over 200 bather compositions in his lifetime. But I realized that the question of that the subject bathers was not that interesting to me. And so I switched to a subject which is very interesting to me, lovers. So this picture is called Lovers. And this was the beginning of something which you'll see slowly happening in my life and in my pictures. All my life I've had a rather small repertory company of images that I love, mainly from previous art, sometimes an occasional little snapshot, a cutting from a magazine, very few, 20, 25 of these things, which I always keep, and I've kept for maybe 30 years or more. Now, each of these figures in the Lovers are based on one of the company, this repertoire, one of these, the figures in this repertory company. The figure on the far left, for instance, is a figure that I use over and over again in many pictures of mine. It's the little Thames bargeman of Whistler in his painting of Old Battersea Bridge. There he is, this haunting figure stuck at the bottom of Battersea Bridge of the piling, standing on what seems to be a barge. They each have a source of that kind. The one on the, for instance, the one on the far right is a figure I've loved, perhaps the most sexually attractive figure I've ever seen in all of art, an Egyptian girl by Sargent. And I'm going to see if I can find it for you. Yes, she's here. I can see her head. There she is, the sexiest girl in all of art. So they're called lovers because in most cases they're either intertwined or they're assuming loving positions, sometimes highly erotic ones. This figure comes from a beloved still of W.C. Fields, which I'll try to find for you. And that's this figure right here, making some kind of love to this womanly figure next to him. It's that form, if you can get close enough to see it, that I love so deeply. One strange source, I have no idea what or who this creature is. I've had for ages, ever since I was a young man. I don't know who he is. He may have been a leper. There's the figure in the middle, based on that one. In my old age, I seem to enjoy doing this even more than having someone pose for me. In earlier days, I might have had people posing for various figures, but I enjoy my solitude, and I have this company to keep me company. The only guess at a narrative that we can all make is that what haunted him were his childhood, youthful times with Zola and Byle and their pals on the riverbank when they were boys, reciting poetry to each other. Obviously, there's some connection to that period which he dreamed about all his life. Now, what no one can figure out are the sexual ingredients, because no one really knows what goes on between a man and a woman, or what goes on sexually in the minds of men and women. And there's obviously something going on in these 200 Bather compositions. But the way that he was willing to forego correct drawing and correct proportions is so attractive to us late modernists that it's overwhelming that this was done when it was, when now it's so common to do whatever you like. I've been working on this frieze for a few years now. Doesn't look it, but it's true. It's been here for at least 2 years since I knew about this National Gallery show. This is the first inkling of working in the aura of Cézanne. But then something extraordinary happened. I have a picture of Sandra here, the last painting I made before she died. It was unfinished. I only did her face and scrubbed in the background. And so when I got here 5 years ago, back home in California, I painted the black suit without her. And I sat down with my blank canvases And I thought, well, now, I've made a start on lovers. Then something came to me. Lovers. I'll do Sandra and myself. Two figures in an encounter. Only later did it occur to me how rare that is in our modern art, our post-Picasso era. The man and the woman in a sexual or erotic or love situation. Since the death of Picasso and Matisse, very, very few people have worked on that subject at all. I would call it the greatest story ever told. That's what they usually say about the Christ story. But for me, the greatest story ever told is the man-woman question. So this is the first one. Sandra and me together. I have her in the studio every day of my life. I talk to her all day long. Isaiah Berlin, my dear friend who died, cautioned me. I told him I talked to her all the time. And Isaiah said to me, "She's not there," which is a potent memory for me. But I'm not sure he was right. And in fact, she is here in spirit, as we all know. So she's slumping over the table, and I'm merging here. You can see the faces merging together. I'm not sure where the idea of angels' wings occurred. I can't remember exactly what the chronology was, but almost instantaneously that I made her and me into angels, I realized what the titles of the paintings would be. The Angels, Los Angeles. So here, in an instant, I came to be able to answer all the friends and strangers who wanted to know if California was having any effect on me. Here was LA having an effect on me in the most extraordinary way due to the National Gallery instigating these pictures. God knows whether it would have happened otherwise. Something drew me to Manet, which is quite interesting. I thought my pictures were too orderly and often too finished in a strange way. It was his disorder that drew me to him, what someone called Manet's awkward composition, and of course his awkward brushstroking. And this was so available to me in the etchings and lithographs that I began to buy them in the early 70s when I could afford them. So I could have an image of Manet's disorder for my very own. And these awkward shapes and something less than punctilious attention to detail attracted me. I loved the strokes in the background, which I would have been incapable of myself in those years, and slowly taught myself to free up. Manet allowed me to free myself up. This is a strange one. This was a canvas of Sandra's standing on her easel out there near the swimming pool for almost 5 years. That's why all this grime is left on the canvas. It was weathering, and I've been trying to fix it because I like the grime. It's not what you might think, an overworked painting. It was a painting which had been failed and painted over in white, I guess, ready for a new composition. And so the composition came quite quickly based on this other Cézanne, which is not exactly a bather, but certainly a precursor of the bathers. These little Olympias that he made after the idea of Manet's Olympia. Let's go to the third one. Los Angeles number 3. Here we are again in a Los Angeles setting. This is the pool and one of my palm trees back there with the yellow studio in a minimalist form. And in fact, I often like to glance around this little yellow studio of mine because I get ideas from different things that I've stuck up on the walls. I'll show you where this idea came from. Here's the yellow studio, and this here is the reflection of the yellow studio in the water. And I'll show you what gave me the idea. A very old print of mine of a book that I own by the great poet Yeats. And this was the design on the cover. There's the tower, and there's the reflection of the tower in the water. And I even interrupted the reflection in the tower with this idea that he has a foliage. By the way, I just read the other day talking about my yellow studio. I had it painted yellow because of Van Gogh's Yellow House in Arles. So I asked them to use those chrome yellows that he used. But I found the most marvelous saying the other day by Kandinsky. Yellow is the color of life. Maybe that's why it hurts our eyes so much. Good, isn't it? Now, 35 years ago or more, I was doing these book covers. It was my answer to Andy Warhol's soup cans. He liked soup cans and I like books. So I was answering Andy at that time. And I asked the printer, the great printer Chris Prater, who died some years ago, print me up one of these book covers on these large canvases. And then I forgot about them. Until 35 years or more later, I came to California. We were unpacking, and I found 2 or 3 of these canvases that Chris had screen printed the cover of a avant-garde magazine of the period called Abstraction Création. Actually, the group that you see listed on the side were all members of this Abstraction Création. In any case, I had this strange silkscreen canvas with a blank square in it. So I decided to use that square for a new version of Los Angeles, the Angels. This yellow figure, I just glanced to the side and took the form, the pose that Sandra has in that portrait right next to it. Now, for 2 years, I've been working on these things slowly and not methodically and not to exhaustion, most of the time not knowing what stroke to use next, which, as far as we know, was Cézanne's method. There's a marvelous story that Matisse tells. He was too timid to visit the old man in Aix. But when he died, he went to visit Cézanne's widow. And Cézanne's widow said to Matisse, "You must understand, young man, Cézanne didn't know what he was doing. He had no idea how to finish a picture," she said. Here lies the attraction. Here lies the mystery. It occurred to me a long time ago that I was just as attracted to this old guy as Picasso and Matisse and Bonnard and all the others were 100 years ago. And over the years, it seems to me that I'm attracted to him for the same reasons they were, because of the mystery. They couldn't figure out, Picasso and Matisse could not figure out what was going on in this old man's mind. I've racked my brain trying to figure out what the sources are, what the precedents are, and some of them are fairly easy to guess at. Maybe his love of Manet, the blurry, brushed-in figures in the backgrounds of Manet, or the quick sketches of Delacroix, whom he adored. But the mystery remains. They came out of the blue. These things come out of his head. So it's what was going on in that head that seems to have attracted Matisse and Picasso. And I can only guess because that's what attracts me. In their case, it attracted them all their lives. This is the next one, and it has a very strange story indeed. I know it looks strange. It comes from the Barnes bathers. The figures on the extremities are very, very interesting. This one, on the extreme left, is called by historians the penis head. The head looks like a penis. So the figure is degendered in some strange way that no one will ever be able to decipher. Even more strange is this famous photograph by Emile Bernard, with Cézanne sitting in front of this picture a year or two before he died in 1906. The figure on the extreme left is still a woman with a woman's head, not a penis head. So that means that sometime between Bernard's photograph and Cézanne's death, he changed the head into this incredible form that we see later, not only in Picasso many times, but in Francis Bacon, 100 years later. Now the figure on the extreme right in the Bernard photograph is clearly a woman with her arms behind her head, leaning on the tree, and there's her sexual area, the triangle. But what happens after the photograph? Cézanne degenders it again. He blurs the face and he puts a penis in the sexual area. This kind of thing must have driven Picasso and Matisse out of their minds with fascination. And I think they'll go on driving painters crazy for years and years to come. I took the two extremities and I put them together in this picture. So we have Sandra and me together. There she is, and there's the penis head. It's a montage of the two extreme figures. I made this cock as amorphous as it seems to be in that reproduction. It's hard to tell. I'd have to go to the museum and study it more closely. So here we are, brought together even more closely than in the other pictures. The wings become afterthoughts, like rainbows, little bits here and there. I like to play with them. Of course, no one's going to fly with them. One thing that drives me crazy about these pictures is the dubious quality of the white. I've never left so much white canvas. I know other painters have done that, Cy Twombly and Morris Lewis and others, but it sort of runs against the grain. And then I began to like it. I always keep Sandra's book of Emily Dickinson's poetry by my easel. And Emily Dickinson has a most marvelous term which she uses for death. She calls it the white exploit. So I began to think that this was a white exploit. And day after day after day, I sit in front of these pictures thinking, what shall I put here? And what shall I put here? What shall I do with the volume? Shall I make it more of a volume or leave it in its contradictory way as it is here? I was so worried about the white canvas that I found an excuse in the working of the painting and the composition. I found an excuse to stick something in here. Sandra's pose comes from a picture which Cézanne may never have, certainly never saw, but must have loved from books, from what is supposed to be the last painting of Titian, left in his studio when he died, the famous Pietà, which I saw with Sandra only once in my life in Venice in the Accademia. But this gave me the opportunity to slide a figure along the left-hand side. This is a figure of Moses. In my picture, you have the Moses figure along the left-hand side. And in effect, you have four Jews, Sandra and me and Moses and Jesus Christ in the Sandra pose, which amused me. And will not amuse a lot of people who are listening to this. I never had all my Jewish books together in London, and I do have them here. The question of a Jewish art interests me enormously and is very, very controversial. It turns off a lot of Jews, for instance, who don't want to know about Jewish art. And I don't blame them. There are marvelous Jewish painters who don't want to even consider the idea, for the very good reason that painters want to be universally accepted and not accepted as a Jew or in any particular way. About halfway through my life, I became obsessed with what I like to call the Jewish question. And two things really obsessed me more than anything else. One was, why are these people so hated? For 4,000 years, they've always gotten themselves into trouble. Aside from this, the other question which interested me enormously was the question of Jewish modernism. In almost every other discipline, there were Jews among the founding fathers of all the other tracks in the humanities that you can think of. But it didn't happen in the art of painting for some reason. There is no Picasso among Jews. There is no Cézanne. And so it began to interest me to find out more about the Jews who were fine artists, and there were arguably a dozen or so wonderful painters, from, say, Pissarro in the late 19th century to Lucian Freud today. And so this library was born, and all the paraphernalia in this room, where I tried to think over these issues. And I hope that in some complex way they enter into the picture making out in the studio. This is the last one to go to London. In this case, I liked it so much, just as it is, that I doubt if I'll ever do anything to it. I tried to think what to do next, how to stroke it next. In effect, what Cézanne was doing at the end of his life in these bathers and other late pictures was he was stealing the methods of his own watercolors, where he fondles and caresses the edges and leaves the volumes blank. So you begin to see a kind of geography of paint, contour, blank paper, in this case canvas. The geography continues, and you begin to read it like that. And the imagination has to supply the volume. Playing with the contours the way he did. In my case, it was a lesson that I was trying to learn as if I placed myself where Picasso and Matisse and Bonnard and all those guys were 100 years ago, seeing the bathers for the first time. I'll show you where this came from. This was from one of those 200 bather compositions. I have so many Cézanne books I could tear out the same picture. I love it when the color printing is different. So I brought them together like that, and it occurred to me, we have another subject. There are the two together, only it's me and it's her. She, her. I sort of doubt that I'll do much to this, but you never know. Just this last week, I've been touching these paintings, even before you came. I've been working on this big, strange one. When I say working, not working very hard, just an idea occurs to me. So the longer they stay with me, the more likely there'll be small changes.
We all tend to pull up the drawbridge as we get older, and people live in our minds and we associate with them rather more than in fact. But he was fun, and he was a valuable addition to London life.
He was just a catalyst. I mean, it was very important to have him around.
Well, I think actually he's settled. LA is a place you can live very, very privately. You don't really have to meet anybody at all if you don't want. You know, you move around in your own space as well. And actually, I see he's got a subject there, and he just stay there and do it. Yeah.
I should have said before we started that there's wine afterwards. That's perhaps the most important thing I should have mentioned. So, sitting to my left, we have Colin Wiggins, who's made the film that we've just watched. Colin was at the National Gallery for over 30 years as Head of Education and Special Projects Curator. And he was responsible for the Associate Artists Scheme, and in 2001 he curated the exhibition Kitaj in the Awe of Cézanne and Other Masters, which that film accompanied. Marinka Elić was a friend of Kitaj's and was one of his most important life models in the 70s and the early 80s. And at Piano Noble at the moment we have two pictures of Marinka, one of which is on the screen, Red Eyes. And Jennifer Ram-Kalawan is Curator of Modern and Contemporary Nordic Graphic Art at the British Museum, and her catalogue raisonné of Kitaj's prints was published in 2013. So I thought, Marinka, it'd be interesting. We've just seen Kitaj in the guise of this quite wizened, learned figure, the beard, the thick glasses, and I wanted to ask how your recollection of him differed, because you met him in the 70s, and I mean, I imagine
it's quite painful to see in a strange way. He's different. He's very different. After he left England, he changed. After Sandra died, basically.
And when
it's quite emotional, really. I found it. It's certainly interesting, and he always thought of his work in a very professional way, and yes, he would describe things as he did. He would be quite dedicated to what he was doing. I did see him in a different way, though, yes.
And when was it in kind of the mid-1970s you met?
In 1974, David Hockney had introduced me on his birthday, and I think he was 42, and after that I modelled with him. The year later I did the Rash Act, the first picture, which was, it was very lovely actually, and I thought, oh, my mother's going to love this picture. And I went on the last sitting, let's say, and there was a blowjob in the background, and I don't know, I was a bit surprised really. I had no idea this was going to happen, but I just love working with him actually, and it didn't stop me wanting to model for him. I had loved his work before, and David was rather marvellous. I was quite bohemian, and I think it suited Kitaj, someone like that, as a model.
Mm. And do you remember the atmosphere in his studio when he would sit down to make a life drawing?
Yes, he would actually have the radio on, Radio 3, classical music, and it sometimes was out of sync. It wasn't tuned in properly. He didn't sort of notice it too much. He was really busy. He was always working, and if it was a pastel, he would be spitting on the picture and smoothing it, the colours. It was rather marvellous. I mean, he got totally engrossed in his work.
Yeah.
I didn't move. I was very good. 3 hours it was sittings on Sundays. We'd have a little break, and that's all. We just continued working, really.
I thought one of the most interesting things about your film, Colin, that we just watched was the shots of Kitaj actually working on his canvases, and to see the kind of the careful, methodic kind of the approach to the canvas. I mean, some of those late pictures are particularly open and kind of quite free, but then when you see him working on them, you've got this marvellous sense of how considered they are.
Yeah, I think that's something that he achieved because of his understanding that that's how Cézanne used to work in his late pictures. That every mark, and when you look closely at Cézanne, there's none of that going on. You think that he's thought about every mark before he puts it down, and then once he's put it down, back, and then thinks another mark needs to go there. And I think that's what Kitaj thought, rightly or wrongly, was the way that Cézanne worked, and he was really enthralled to Cézanne. I mean, as you saw in the film, I mean, he's quite obsessive about his admiration for Cézanne. But in a way, I mean, what Marinka was saying, when he opened the door to me when I visited him in Los Angeles, I wasn't ready for this old man with the white beard and the hearing aid that kept whistling. And as he said, I'm 68, but I mean, 68, I mean, he looks about 88, doesn't he? And I mean, I've had met him, first of all, in London. I wrote to him when I was actually a student, and he was really kind to me. And the first time I met him, he was hugely charismatic, and he really had the sort of film star qualities.
And that would have been in the
late 70s. I met him, and Sandra. I got to know Sandra, and the transformation. There had been a deliberate intention to skip late middle age and jump from being like middle-aged to geriatric. We'll miss out that other bit. It was deliberate, and he was acting as a real old man. And I think that there were other elements in there too, because the Jewish thing, he wanted to be like an Old Testament Jewish prophet, and you needed the white beard to do that. And he also loved Hollywood films. And I think there's those characters in westerns that he talks about, the old timer, with the grizzled beards. He wanted to be like that as well. And he mentioned Moses in the film as well, because I mean, it was almost him wanting to be like this sort of Old Testament Moses type of character, and act this role as a way of dealing with the loss of Sandra.
Yes.
Because he really suffered when Sandra died. I mean, it was awful for him. Now, people lose partners, Rembrandt lost Saskia, and we know that he hit the depths but quickly recovered. And likewise Rubens with his first wife, Isabella, we know from this correspondence how badly he was affected by it. And Kitaj likewise, it was really Max, I think, that kept him going, the son that he and Sandra had. And as he says in the film, he didn't want to uproot Max from school, but once he'd finished with that school, off they went to LA to be near his family, because Kitaj's son lived just a few minutes walk away from that house that he bought in Los Angeles, that he liked to say had been lived in before by Peter Lorre. Because Peter Lorre, another great Hollywood, shall we say, over-the-top actor.
And this idea of Kitaj and actors and identity, he was very kind of, he could be very flexible with the identity that he wanted to wear, or the kind of identity that he wanted to project in his art. And I think I was wondering, could we talk a little bit about how his work kind of was, he inflected his work over a lifetime with very different identities. I mean, we've just been looking at his work from Los Angeles, but I mean, from earlier periods, I mean, we've got some pictures that are hanging at Piano Nobile, all from the 60s on the screen. I mean, when he was making this drawing of you, Marinka, Red Eyes, yes. I think the source for that was...
Giotto.
Giotto, exactly.
Yeah. They had themes quite often.
Yeah. And how did that...
It just happened over... I mean, I didn't know he was so obsessed by Giotto, but all of a sudden he was. He had these wonderful spontaneous things, ideas, and he would do them.
And they kind of come up through the work.
He'd execute the work, yeah.
Thinking about Kitaj and the British Museum, I know we saw some of those Cézanne drawings that he made after the pictures that were hanging in the Royal Academy early Cézanne exhibition. I wondered, Jenny, can you talk a bit about what the British Museum has and Kitaj's relationship with the British Museum?
Well, Kitaj's relationship with the British Museum goes back to the 80s or late 70s when he would come in with Sandra. So you can, in fact, when I was writing the book, I obsessively went through our visitors' books and found his signature with Sandra in there. And I think, Colin, you must have remembered them coming in.
Yeah, my first job was actually in the Department of Prints and Drawings at the British Museum. And that's when I first got to know Sandra, because she was often in the students' room, and she would be given a drawing by Michelangelo that she'd set up on an easel, and she'd draw from it. She was doing a lot of drawing. Then when I first wrote to Kitaj, I mean, this is nothing to do with it, it's just a funny story. I wrote to him, and because I wanted to see his paintings by Frank Auerbach, who I was obsessed with then and still am. And Frank very kindly had given me Kitaj's address, so I wrote to him saying, I understand you've got like 6 paintings, so Frank said, I'd love to come and see them, I'm a big fan, etc. And he invited me, and I remember going into this studio, into the house, looking at these Auerbachs with him, and walking past Kitaj's paintings. There was one half finished on the easel that's now in the Tate, a picture called The Orientalist. And I just said, oh, that's yours, right? Not in, okay, look at Frank's. And it's only when I got out into the street afterwards, I thought, oh my God, he must have thought I was so rude, because I didn't even bother to look at his pictures and thinking, oh, that's not going to end well. And it was later that Sandra told me he absolutely loved that, because he was used to people going into his studio saying, oh, this is so wonderful. And I just completely dismissed them, but not deliberately, because I was so enthused for Frank's paintings, which is why I managed to get Frank to be in the film as well. And Peter and Hockney as well, of course, were all more than happy, because one thing I think we need to talk about Kitaj and say, this is a very important part of his life. He was, as Peter said, he was a catalyst. He brought things together. The Human Clay exhibition at the Hayward Gallery in 1976 was profoundly important, because it was solely figurative work that he'd selected, single figures drawings and paintings of single figures, and he writes in the catalogue that I actually reread yesterday about how I wanted to write just to show these, and because everything else then in British art was abstraction or pop, and the idea of just drawing from the human figure was way swimming against the tide. And then that's when Kitaj famously came up with the idea of the School of London, that later got rechristened the so-called School of London, but it still helped to draw critical attention to that core of figurative artists, Bacon, Freud, Albert, Kossoff, Mike Andrews, that Kitaj was trying to push as being as important as anything happening anywhere else in the world, and I think he was right. And because of this Kitaj's kind of agitation on behalf of those artists, it had a profound influence.
And thinking about drawing from the human figure, drawing from life, I mean, Sandra Fisher was incredibly important in that respect. I don't know...
I worked with her.
Pardon?
I worked with her.
Yeah. So you modelled for Sandra as well as for Kitaj. We had, coming into the exhibition the other week, someone who said that they modelled for Sandra as well, and they, Sandra wouldn't let Kitaj draw this particular person because she said, oh, he would do a masterpiece, and then that would ruin it.
I think she was very modest about her own talent. I mean,
yes.
we have a drawing by Sandra in the collection, and I think we're probably the only national museum that has work by her. And she was terribly influential, making Kitaj look at Degas and look at the pastels, and and just going back to what you were saying about the British Museum, I think what Frank Auerbach was saying in Colin's film about Kitaj using a conflation of fragments, that is the essence of him, I think. And just going back to what you were saying about his connection with the British Museum, he left us almost 300 works on paper, mostly prints, and he had a kind of love-hate relationship with his early prints from the 60s. And they are conflations of fragments from everywhere. And his mind is working overdrive, and it's interesting to see that he's working so slowly on his paintings, because frankly that frustrated him. And he could use printmaking as a kind of experimental laboratory for working out ideas very quickly. So he could work on a print, give it to Chris Prater, he would print it, he could see how the images were moving around on the paper. And so that's why he kind of embraced printmaking, obviously to sell prints, but he wasn't very successful in selling his prints at all. They really understood them. And then towards the end of his life, it's interesting to see in the film that he has, in our time, tacked up some on his wall. And he's still using, he's still learning from those prints. He's still gaining some kind of interest. I mean, he even manipulates one of the prints, and so he wanted to actually give these works to the British Museum, and I think it's because it's the idea of his work sort of rubbing shoulders with Rembrandt, with Michelangelo, with all, with Cézanne, all his sort of great heroes. And, he talks about the late drawings of Michelangelo being so moving, and some of the works that he really, really loves. And I read, I think it was in your catalogue, about him selling his house in Elm Park Road to Johannes Wilder, who is the great Michelangelo specialist on drawings, which is a very odd Kitaj connection. It's actually rather nice.
Well, also something that Frank Auerbach mentions that's very, very important too was the fact that he went to Edgar Vint's lectures in Oxford. Edgar Vint was one of the many art historians who fled the Nazis and settled here and actually invented the discipline of art history in London. And when he was giving these lectures in Oxford, and he and Kitaj became friends. And Vint's lectures were very much about the Renaissance and the iconography, and people like Panofsky as well, writing about the picture we used to call the Arnolfini marriage, that we now have to call the Arnolfini portrait. But all of the obscure details of the iconography is really what captured Kitaj's imagination, and the references that most people found very obscure, because when I was a student, Francis Bacon's interviews with David Sylvester were all over the place, and Bacon uses words that are bad words, like illustrational, or even worse, anecdotal. And therefore, artworks that have got illustrations in of ideas or tell stories were bad, as Frank points out with his very tongue-in-cheek description of the art world then, with the sloshing of brushes and to join with the universe and save us all from the atomic bomb. That's what was going on then. So the idea of something that told a story or had a reference was seen as something that was bad. And I think that's one of the reasons why Kitaj's Tate show made such a kind of bad hit with much of the art press. Not all by any means. There were lots of supportive articles, but I think Kitaj's turn of mind is that he'd have read something in support of him and stuck it over there, and then got the one that did him down, and that's the one that would have got into him.
Really hurt him.
Yes, would have really hurt him.
And talking of the iconography,
Yeah.
and I thought it was very interesting in the film where he's talking about Western bathers that he describes as a puzzle picture which people can read into as they like. He was quite relaxed, wasn't he, about people not necessarily grasping the references that he was making in his work. I don't think that particularly did that weigh on him. I don't know.
Well, I think he knew that his references were so obscure that people weren't going to get them. And if the visual impact was not interesting, we wouldn't be talking about the pictures now. It's like you look at an artist like Poussin, who the hell knows what the death of Germanicus is about? But we still want to look at these pictures. It's the visual impact, the visual appeal, that then makes us want to go and find out who Germanicus was and what it was that killed him. But first of all, it's the visual impact that makes Kitaj, I think, such a wonderful artist. And it's then you can start delving into it a bit and think, now hold on, what's going on there? What does he mean by this? What does he mean by that? But unless the painting was good as a visual artwork, it wouldn't be of interest.
That's something that Richard Morfitt, who curated the Tate exhibition in 1994, he came to visit Piano Noble's exhibition, and he was saying that I mean, the negative reviews can't have been good for the visitor numbers, because it was around 30,000 people that visited that Tate exhibition. But the point he was making was you had an excellent quality of visitor because everyone who came was very slow, and they all read the texts, and they were obviously drawn in by the pictures, as you say, Colin.
Yeah.
And it was that motivated them to actually get deeper under the skin of Kitaj's pictures, because I mean, as we know, his pictures were incredibly layered, and he concealed many things within those layers.
And do you think that's why he? I mean, he's someone you have to work at. It involves work, and I think that's why he. I mean, we love him because for me, that's the whole essence of him. You know, I want to know what's going on. I think it's fascinating, particularly in the prints. My God, the references there are just so incredible. And you know, someone needs to really do a lot of research on those. My book just skimmed the surface, but they're so rich in all the references that he was interested in. And that's why don't you think that's why he because you have to work at him. He's not there mentioned with, you know, our Hockney, Freud, and that's what we were talking about earlier. Why is he not?
And I think
given his dues.
This question of how Kitaj and his work have been received since your film, Colin, in 2001, and since his death in 2007, I think I wonder if any of you have kind of an idea about how the reception of his work is changing or has changed in that time, and how it might continue to change. I think, like you say, Jenny, you know, the continued exposure to his work only deepens an appreciation of his work. Don't know how.
Well, I think that's why your exhibition has been so brilliantly reviewed. I mean, it's kind of introduced Kitaj to the next generation of people that don't remember the Tate show, who don't associate him with, you know, that awful period in his life, and actually come to him fresh. And I think that is going to be the way that he's going to be perceived. You know, not with all the baggage, I think.
Well, also in Berlin there was a huge big show, the show called Obsession, which has got a wonderful catalogue. And that was in a major show, and they wanted to bring it to London.
Oh, yeah.
And, well, I mean, it didn't get shown at the Tate, it didn't get shown at the Royal Academy. It would have looked fabulous.
Exactly, it should have been at the Royal Academy.
But instead, it had to be split into two. It was shown partly at the Jewish Museum, when it was in Albert Street, and partly at Pallant House. And Pallant House, of course, puts on fantastic exhibitions with extraordinary artists who don't get shown in the big London galleries. The fact that it was shown in Pallant House and the Jewish Museum had to be split between two non-London venues was more this country's fault than Kitaj's fault. Because if that had gone to the Royal Academy, it would have looked absolutely beautiful, because the paintings do look absolutely
They need
beautiful.
the room as well.
Yeah, absolutely do. And that was the fault of whoever it was running the Royal Academy or the Tate Gallery at that time. I've got no idea who it was, but it was their fault.
Well, I remember, because that's the time I was writing the catalogue and it was about to come out. And I was so excited, there's going to be a Kitaj exhibition in London, thinking it would be maybe at the Haywood or a huge venue. And I was appalled. It was in a tiny, well, it wasn't a big room in the Jewish Museum.
No, it wasn't.
And Pallant House, fantastic gallery though it is, the rooms are small.
Yeah.
And so you couldn't appreciate what was a great opportunity to see Kitaj's work together. It was so sad. I saw the show when it was in Hamburg, and it was fantastic, absolutely fantastic.
I think before we open the floor to questions, one last thing I wanted to ask was about Kitaj's sense of humour. I think in that film he was doing his best to come across as a very studious lecturer with his glasses and his, I don't know, going from picture to picture. He's got all of his books open like he's prepared. But there's in many of his pictures, in somewhere that deep down, there's either a sense of irony or a twist in the tale or some kind of screwball playfulness. I don't know, Marinka, did you get the sense of that? Yeah.
There was always a twinkle in his eye, but he was always very serious. But you couldn't help but love him, actually. Really, he had lovely, warm qualities about him, and very welcoming. And I met all his family, and generous. Very kind.
No, he had no idea who I was when I wrote to him from Manchester University, but was so welcoming and generous. And it was not everybody who I wrote to was. I'm still waiting for a couple of replies from. But terrific. Yeah, and it was very easy to get him to talk. I mean, I said, can I come and just record a short interview? No more than like 10 minutes. And he said, yeah, no more than 10 minutes. I don't want to do anything like appear on camera or anything, but a short interview, that's fine. And so I went over, and a shout out to my ex-colleague Marcus Latham at the National Gallery, who was behind the camera and who actually cut all those things together that you saw. I made quite a few films with Marcus. He was really, really good. But this 10-minute thing, it took 2 days to shoot that film. And he'd got these things hidden as if he was going to find them. Like, let me see if I can find them. Oh, yes. And holding it up to the camera to make a point. He'd obviously prepared for our visit. And we went round the whole house and studio with him accidentally stumbling across the thing that he would need at that particular moment. Which is why in the catalogue essay that I wrote for your show, I called the film a self-portrait on film, Kitaj in Hollywood. He was acting this man. It wasn't Kitaj we saw, it was the role he was acting for the camera. Bless him.
That's a great note to open the floor to questions. Does anyone have any questions?
Yes. He certainly did.
No, I just wanted to add a footnote. There's a backstory to this work, the backstory to the Pallant House thing. I contributed to the catalogue in the Jewish Museum in Berlin, so I heard that it wasn't going to be shown in England at all. It was the Tel Aviv drop fell through, so I persuaded Pan & House to take it. That was the best England
Well
could do.
done, yeah.
It wasn't going to come to England at all, so...
Was Simon the director then?
No, it was the previous director, yeah.
Oh yeah, whose name, he sure may name this.
Yeah, but on the general, yes, I wrote to him in 1973 and got, as an undergraduate, and got a very warm response. And,
yeah.
Amazing man, yeah. And still a very underrated artist.
Well, hopefully this show can lead to something that will rectify that.
Any other questions?
Well, it's just an idea, really. Colin, you mentioned about the human clay. I was an art student in Newcastle at the time, and Kitaj's collection of drawings in the human clay, I stupidly didn't come down to London for it. I don't know why, but I treasured that catalogue. And I was talking to somebody at the Courtauld today and thinking, well, a lot of those drawings are owned by the Arts Council.
That's right, yes.
And I was thinking, wouldn't it be stupendous? Sorry, I'm not being very good. Wouldn't it be amazing for the Arts Council to gather those drawings together as a way of kind of honouring Kitaj, who was very generous, as an art teacher in a school. He replied when I wrote to him in America and said he was enjoying life playing with his grandchildren. And I just think it would be very interesting. I mean, if I was a life drawing tutor in an art college, I'm not, it would just be so fantastic a resource. But we've already got the drawings. They're state-owned, aren't they?
Well, for that, the human clay, Kitaj was one of many people. Each year, the Arts Council then commissioned somebody to buy for the Arts Council collection. And Kitaj did it for a year with a budget. And he went round acquiring these drawings specifically of single-figure artworks. And that's what the Arts Council has got. They're now all in the Arts Council collections. And at that time as well, he really did stand up for drawing. Him and Hockney, the two of them went hand in hand to say, look, what's wrong with drawing? And it was the time, I mean, I've done teaching, I'm still teaching at Camberwell Art School from time to time, but one of the tutors there told me that they did have at Camberwell a lot of those that they got from the 19th century onwards, casts of classical sculptures. But one day in the 1970s they had a year zero moment when all the tutors and students smashed all these plaster casts and stuck them all in a cupboard, and they're still there apparently, the fragments are still there, as a rejection of the idea of students sitting in the life class. I mean, Picasso sat in the life class for God knows how long. Another great artist who died a couple of years ago, Paula Rego, says that the most important year of her life was sitting in the life room at the Slade, drawing from the life model every single day. And she couldn't have made those amazing things that she made for the rest of her career without that experience. But you don't have to do life drawing if you don't want to. But I think it is, I mean, go to see the Hockney show at the NPG if you haven't seen it yet. Whoa, crikey, proper art, drawing. I always tell students that there's two things you really have to master before you become an artist: drawing and colouring in. And without those, that's how you need to start. And you don't have to keep within the lines. Jagger didn't.
Any other questions? Yep, Andrew. Andrew, oh, sorry, Andrew. Wait a second, Andrew. Someone at the back's got a question. Sorry, you next. Yeah, go.
Colin, you might have provided a bit of an answer to how you categorize. Well, I didn't realize the extent to which you might say he was acting in the film. But as someone who just from hearing him speak for the first time, that seems very self-sure And it seems that he's not necessarily a pop artist in the sense that he's using images that are hundreds of years old and texts that are 100 years old. I'm curious as to what the criticism, how you feel, why the criticism that surrounded this exhibition affected him so much, and if it was just the general nature of criticism, or if there was a sort of a pointed critique that influenced him, or...
That's a good question, and it could be asked about so many artists. I think he had, like all proper artists, have a total belief in their own ability and their own significance. And when other people don't get it, you start to doubt. And artists that I've worked with, they're usually a kind of combination of a ego, a self-confidence, an ability. I know that that I've got this right, but also a lack of confidence. The two things that are a complete contradiction. I think Kitaj's confidence took a battering, and he was so enraged at these writers, and I don't know this, but I'm sure he would have written back to them in pretty forthright language. Sandra was caught in the crossfire. And as Hockney said, that sometimes it's the person who loves the person who feels it more. And in a way, he was very self-centered, but then artists are. You have to be totally self-centered, otherwise you're not an artist. There's no use kind of, oh, it's 5 o'clock, I knock off now and go home to the wife and kids. All the artists I know, if they've got a wife and kids, the wife and kids know that they are of secondary importance in the artist's life. So I think it just gave him such a battering. And the only artist I know who treats all critics with utter contempt is Maggie Hambling. She is cast iron, and it doesn't seem to affect her. Bless her.
So it doesn't stop her. I remember when we did the show at the British Museum, and she got a 3-star review, and she phoned me up on Sunday morning as if it was my fault.
Andrew Dempsey and then Sarah Wilson.
Back to, we moved on, back to the human clay. And it's worth just saying that it was conceived of as a touring exhibition, and indeed it did tour, and it was organised by something called Parallelia, who was great friend of Sandra Fisher. And particularly for the programme at quite short notice. It was a very modest exhibition. I think many people here will have seen it. It was small-scale work, which he drew from work that he bought, but also work that had been bought by other people. I mean, Patrick George was one of the purchasers who preceded him, buying works for the Art Council, and he had included a number of things that Patrick had bought. It was a modest show. It was very powerful.
And I should say Andrew knows what he's talking about because he worked at the Hayward Gallery for, I mean, I don't know how long, Andrew, a long time.
A long time, yes. And I was there at that time. But, it was 76, I think, 77.
It was 76, I think, yeah, because I just graduated at the time. And I do remember thinking, wow, this is...
He showed work in the first Hayward Annuals the following year.
Yeah.
In a single room, which was pretty impressive. Absolutely flying.
Could we have the mic down here, please?
So thank you. Apropos of the Tate exhibition, there is a question of historical memory at stake because people haven't really mentioned the huge kind of Peter Fuller, Brian Sewell moment which was not only a return to sometimes figurative painting, but I understood, and of course I was there at the time, that the attacks were to do with the fact that he was presented as an intellectual, and it was very, very much to do with British anti-intellectualism. It wasn't just quote-unquote bad reviews, it was, who is this pretentious guy?
Yes.
You know, and that was the thing, and I just wanted to congratulate you on the film, because although I do have this very hazy recollections, I said of meeting you him once, I do think if you take really freshly his, you know, Moses mode, I think it was very wonderful, and I do think I didn't have a previous person really to compare with, but if you take him as he is, I think he was extremely charismatic and convincing and great as a late career person. He must also have been thinking of late careers, late Tish and late Suzanne.
I think he was talking about an old age style from the 80s when he was only 50.
So I think he was cultivating that, but at least he was, well, is able to be an intellectual, transcending that rather kind of embarrassing, if not shameful, moment of British art criticism.
Does anyone want to respond to that? I think just one more question in the second row, and then we'll wrap up.
I'd like to elaborate on two things that have been raised. One, the first one, Sarah's point. Kitaj was quite similar in his attitude to Philip Roth, his friend and neighbour.
Well, they were great buddies, weren't they?
Great buddies, yeah. And there were three problems. Roth saw England as anti-Semitic. But there were three problems with him. He played down the other two. The other two were anti-intellectualism and anti-Americanism. So there were kind of three ways of, he found, and exaggerated one of them, namely the anti-Semitism. The other thing was that Kitaj asked me to write about his life for the catalogue, the National Gallery catalogue. He said, not the work, that's Colin's job. He's doing a big interview. You write about the life. And he was quite right. I was not professionally equipped to write about the work. But I did my homework, and I went to the Marlborough Gallery's press cuttings, and I studied all the reviews, and I was quite astonished to find there were only four villains who seemed to be concerted, but whether they were or not. There were four really vicious, ferocious, unpleasant, ad hominem reviews, and there were some fabulous reviews.
Yeah,
some very, very good ones. And he saw the proofs of my article, and I wrote this up. I kind of implied that he'd not overreacted. I wouldn't dare say that, but he originally was saying they killed her, and then he changed it to she was killed she died in the crossfire, or she died of an embolism. I mean, it was an unfortunate coincidence, and but he was sent the proofs, and he accepted. He said it's fine. I was very flattered, very pleased. But I was especially pleased that he didn't say you've understated. You know, you're wrong about the reviewers. So that seemed to me. That's what I would say.
Thank you. I should say it's Anthony Rudolph.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Anthony. So I think we'll wrap it up there. But I should just say before we go and have a glass of wine that we do have copies of Galileo Noble's exhibition catalogue, which you can purchase at the front if you wish to. If you don't wish to, please go and have some wine instead. Thank you. Thank you.